Native American tribes in the Colorado River Basin hold some of the strongest water rights in the American West. Their claims are older than the cities, older than the irrigation districts, and older than the state agencies pulling from the same river. But here is the problem. Having senior rights is not the same as having water arrive at your community. Arizona spent 4 decades turning tribal rights into actual deliveries, and the backup system that keeps those deliveries real is now running out of money. This is the tribal water paradox. The strongest legal claims in the basin are being supported by some of the weakest financial plumbing. The conflict begins with a historic exclusion. 30 federally recognized tribes were left out of the original 1922 compact that divided the Colorado River. A century later, Arizona allocated roughly 46% of its entire Central Arizona project supply to tribal nations. That allocation is backed by a firming obligation, meaning a promise to make lower priority water perform like more reliable water, extending to the year 2108. But Arizona built that promise on underground paper credits, property taxes, and a groundwater fee capped at $2.50 per acre-foot. All three are now shrinking, under attack, or priced out of a market where backup water trades at $400 and climbing. To understand why this matters, go back to 1908. In Winters v. United States, the Supreme Court ruled that when the federal government created Indian reservations, it implicitly reserved enough water to sustain those reservations as permanent homelands. Priority dates attached to the creation of each reservation. Because many reservations predated widespread Western settlement, tribal claims became chronologically senior to virtually every state-issued water right held by cities and farming districts. These rights could not be forfeited through non-use. They also covered future needs, not just present ones. That legal power did not automatically become wet water. For most of the 20th century, these rights remained unquantified, meaning no final volume had been legally pinned down. Roughly 30% of Navajo Nation residents still lack indoor running water. Across the basin, tribes forego between $938 million and $1.8 billion in potential revenue each year because the infrastructure to deliver the water does not exist. That is the gap at the center of this story. The law says one thing. Pipes, pumps, and money say another. 14 years after Winters, the 7 basin states drafted the 1922 Colorado River Compact. They split the basin at Lee Ferry and required the upper basin to deliver a rolling average of 7.5 million acre-feet annually to the lower basin. The framers built those numbers on flawed hydrology from an unusually wet period. The resulting law of the river failed entirely to quantify tribal claims. Then the Southwest built its dams, reservoirs, and canals on water that legally belonged to tribal nations. The omission was not small. It became one of the foundations of modern Western growth. A first crack at quantification came in 1963 with Arizona versus California. The court allocated 2.8 million acre-feet to the state and pinned down rights for 5 main stem tribes. But the larger claims of interior nations remained unresolved. That included the Navajo, the Gila River Indian community, and the Tohono O'odham. So the legal uncertainty did not disappear. It moved deeper into Arizona's future. By the 1970s, Arizona's aquifers were collapsing. The federal government delivered an ultimatum. No funding for the Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile canal built to deliver 1.5 million acre-feet to Phoenix and Tucson, unless the state passed groundwater controls. That pressure produced the 1980 Groundwater Management Act. The law established active management areas over less than a quarter of the state's land, but over 75% of its population. It mandated safe yield by 2025, meaning pumping would eventually have to match recharge. It also required a 100-year assured water supply for new developments. Then the structural trap locked into place. Urban centers now depended on capped surface water, and those allocations had to be secure. But they were not secure. Many tribal reservations predated Arizona's 1912 statehood, so their unquantified winters claims carried seniority over the CAP itself. Agricultural districts sat at the bottom of the priority stack, and they desperately pushed for negotiated settlements. Everyone wanted certainty. Tribes wanted actual delivery. Non-Indian users wanted the older claims resolved. Arizona's settlement process began with the Ak-Chin Indian Community Act of 1978. 11 congressionally approved acts now exist. Each followed the same basic exchange. Tribes accepted a quantified water volume and federal infrastructure funding, then waived all future claims. That gave non-Indian users the hydrological certainty they needed. It also gave tribes a path toward water they could actually use. But every settlement came with a price. What often gets missed is what tribes had to surrender. Settlements required abandoning claims to reservation expansion. Several nations signed away their right to object if off-reservation pumping depleted aquifers directly beneath their own land. Scholars called these negotiations colonial enclosures, designed to contain indigenous resources rather than empower them. The settlements were not simply technical agreements. They were political bargains made inside a system that had already used the river without tribal consent. Finding actual wet water required restructuring CAP allocations. Non-Indian agricultural districts, squeezed by financial distress and litigation threats, surrendered their long-term entitlements. In exchange, they received temporary access to a cheaper agricultural settlement pool expiring in 2030. The water they gave up carried non-Indian agricultural priority, the lowest classification in the CAP system. That pool is eliminated first during shortages, before municipal and industrial or Indian priority pools lose a drop. The deal made settlement possible, but it built tribal reliability on top of vulnerable water. That is where the paradox crystallizes. Tribal nations traded the most senior water rights in the basin for delivery infrastructure. But the water flowing through those pipes came from the CAP's most exposed pool. President Bush signed the 2004 Arizona Water Settlements Act, settling the Gila River Indian Community and Tohono O'odham claims. The act locked in a framework where approximately 46% of the entire CAP supply belongs permanently to Arizona tribes. The legal victory was real. The hydrological foundation was fragile. Offsetting that vulnerability required a massive, century-scale insurance policy. Firming means making lower priority water perform with the same reliability as municipal and industrial priority during shortages. The 2004 AWSA mandated firming 60,648 acre-feet of NIA water. The state's obligation runs through 2108. It includes 15,000 acre-feet annually for the Gila River Indian Community and 8,724 for future Indian settlements, totaling 23,724 per year. Federal responsibility covers 28,200 acre-feet for the Tohono O'odham Nation. The 2022 Hualapai tribe settlement added another 557.5 acre-feet per year. Managing that obligation fell to the Arizona Water Banking Authority, created in 1996. The AWBA banks unused Colorado River water underground as long-term storage credits. Through 2024, it had stockpiled roughly 4.47 million acre-feet of credits, 3.86 million reserved for Arizona uses, and 0.61 million held as interstate credits for Nevada. Revenue came from groundwater withdrawal fees and a 4-cent ad valorem property tax spread across the CAP service area. On paper, this looked like a practical buffer. In a worsening shortage, it becomes a countdown clock. The 2019 Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan layered tiered cuts onto the system based on Lake Mead elevations. Tier 1 slashes Arizona's supply by 512,000 acre-feet and immediately eliminates the agricultural settlement pool. Tier 2 cuts up to 592,000. Tier 3 wipes out the entire NIA pool. Temporary mitigation softened the blow through 2025, covering 100% of NIA losses from 2020 to 2022, then ramping down to 75% and 50%. Beginning in 2026, that mitigation drops to zero for every user in the system. Between 2022 and 2024, continuous shortage declarations cut Arizona's entitlement so deeply that no excess CAP water existed for the AWBA to store. The agency stopped building reserves and started burning them. Under the 2026 Tier 1 shortage, the AWBA must extinguish 10,221 acre-feet of firming credits for the Gila River Indian community alone. That is up from 6,170 just 2 years earlier. The burn rate is accelerating, while no new wet water storage enters the bank. Buying backup water on the open market has become an arms race. In 2015, the AWBA paid $157 per acre-foot for ICS firming credits. By 2024, the price was $276. For 2026, it reached $290.40, pushed upward by a fixed 3% annual escalator. Open market long-term storage credits swing harder. They were $195 in 2017, $295 by 2023, and the AWBA budgeted over $400 for 2026. The AWBA is not the only buyer. Municipal providers need enormous credit portfolios for assured water supply compliance. Semiconductor factories and hyperscale data centers, fueled by a $600 billion AI infrastructure wave, compete for the same finite pool and treat water entitlements as critical assets worth any premium. The Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District projects rates rising from $349 per acre-foot in 2025 to $406 by 2030. Under extreme shortage modeling, wholesale water prices could spike to $12,840 per acre-foot. A firming promise made in a cheaper water world is now colliding with a much more expensive one. The funding side is weakening at the same time. The 4-cent property tax drops to 3 cents in 2031, cutting AWBA purchasing power by 25%, exactly when prices are rising. The groundwater withdrawal fee remains capped at $2.50. Every acre-foot conserved also reduces the pumping volume those fees are collected on. In other words, successful conservation directly undermines the revenue financing drought resilience. The system is trying to reward less pumping, while depending on pumping to fund its backup plan. Political dysfunction has compounded the problem. On May 5, 2026, Governor Hobbs vetoed a $17.9 billion budget that provided zero funding for the Colorado River Litigation Fund and denied a $30 million deposit into the Colorado River Protection Fund. The Long-Term Water Augmentation Fund was promised $1 billion when it launched in 2022. It has lost over $430 million to cuts, sweeps, and reallocations. These are not abstract budget fights. They determine whether Arizona can defend and finance the water system it promised to tribes. Pinal County is absorbing the physical consequences. 1/4 of Arizona's agricultural sales originate there, and the county ranks in the top 1% nationally for milk and cotton. Agriculture accounted for 90% of cap demand in the Pinal AMA. When Tier 1 hit in 2022, the ag pool lost 65% overnight. By 2023, it vanished completely. The shortage landed first where the priority system said it would land. The local economy shows what that means. Nearly $2.3 billion in economic output, 7,500 jobs, and $356.8 million in labor income depend on that water. Cotton farming employment runs 47.8 times the national average. Modeling projects an $80.7 million drop in gross farm sales and the loss of 270 to 480 jobs. Half the economic damage lands on non-agricultural businesses. In 2023, over 58,600 acres received crop insurance for irrigation supply failure, and state water models project an unmet groundwater demand of 8.1 million acre-feet in the Pinal AMA over the next century. Right next door, tribal operations run by the Ak-Chin and Gila River communities continue producing crops with uninterrupted firmed deliveries. That contrast is legally intentional, because tribal settlements were supposed to make those deliveries reliable. Some non-tribal farmers are pivoting to guayule, a desert shrub requiring 50% less water than cotton. Scaling 100,000 acres could save up to 150,000 acre-feet annually. But the processing infrastructure does not yet exist. Even adaptation has bottlenecks. Then came another legal shock. In June 2023, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in Arizona versus Navajo Nation that the federal government holds no duty to identify or secure tribal water, even while acknowledging valid winter's rights. Justice Gorsuch dissented, calling out the contradiction of a government that excluded the Navajo from the 1922 Compact and then argued it owed them nothing. The ruling did not erase tribal rights. It exposed how hard it is to turn those rights into actual infrastructure when the federal government refuses a duty to help secure the water. The pending Northeastern Arizona Indian Water Rights Settlement Act would authorize $5 billion in infrastructure for the Navajo, Hopi, and San Juan Southern Paiute. The need is not theoretical. 1/3 of Navajo households still haul water in 5-gallon buckets at $600 a month. In March 2026, the Interior Department warned that with $13 billion in settlements pending before Congress, the Reclamation Water Settlement Fund lacks the money to support the bill. So the settlement pipeline is filling up, exactly as the fund behind it runs short. Despite these setbacks, tribes are reshaping basin power. 6 Arizona tribes lease over 150,000 acre-feet annually, exceeding the tap water needs of Tucson or Mesa. Tribes collectively hold rights to 3.2 million acre-feet, roughly 25% of the river's historical flow. During the 2019 DCP negotiations, the Gila River Indian community agreed to leave 640,000 acre-feet in Lake Mead for $90 million in compensation. When Arizona legislators moved to undermine that agreement, the tribe threatened to collapse the entire multi-state deal. The state backed down immediately. Now, every rule governing the Colorado River expires at the end of 2026, forcing a complete renegotiation. The Bureau of Reclamation's draft environmental impact statement evaluates 5 alternatives. Under supply-driven strict priority, Arizona tribal agriculture faces $83.1 million in crop losses during a modeled 2.1 million acre-foot shortage. Under maximum operational flexibility, with 4 million in cuts, tribal losses climb to 101 million. The lower basin states proposed voluntarily cutting 3.2 million acre-feet through 2028, with Arizona absorbing 760,000 per year. The architecture Arizona built to settle tribal claims works as designed, but in a physical reality, far worse than anticipated. The 2004 AWSA did not create new water. It resolved sovereign claims by reallocating junior priority CAP water, now evaporating out of Lake Mead. Keeping that settlement whole depends on paper credits, property taxes, and withdrawal fees managed by the Water Banking Authority. None of those mechanisms can produce a single wet molecule. They can only decide who absorbs the shortage first. If the financial plumbing behind tribal firming fractures through legislative raids, the scheduled tax reduction, or inflationary market pressure, the consequences will not stop at tribal communities. The same backup systems struggling to keep tribal allocations real are the ones relied upon by municipalities, agricultural districts, and industrial corridors across the desert Southwest. Tribal firming is the early warning system. When it breaks, it means the broader promise of permanent water abundance has broken too. The oldest rights on the river are revealing the newest truth. Legal water is not the same as wet water.